Hello, hello, good evening, good evening. My name is Anthony Romero. I'm faculty here in Studio Art, and it is my esteemed pleasure to welcome all of you to the talk tonight. Dan is an artist that I've long admired for many, many years, and as a rising artist in Chicago was someone that I often would look to for inspiration and, more importantly, for solving the riddle of artistic research and political integrity, and how we somehow manage to hold both simultaneously. But Dan Wang is an artist and writer, Chinese-Midwestern by birth. He lives in Los Angeles and Chicago. He makes drawings, prints, sculptures, and organizes events. His obsessions include histories of monetary policy and the afterlives of the French Revolution. Recent projects include commissioned work for Station Museum in Houston and Asian Arts Initiative in Philadelphia, and a Ragbox of Overstood Grammars, a 20-year retrospective of 80-plus letterpress prints, exhibited in 2020 at Fonderie Darling in Montreal, and acquired by the Block Museum of Northwestern University. He often has worked in group situations, as in the past as a founding keyholder of Mess Hall, an experimental cultural space in Chicago, to a current collaboration, Now Time Asian America. His critical writings have been published internationally in book collections, museum catalogs, and in dozens of artist publications. Along with Anthony Romero and Daniel Tucker, he co-edited Last Gaspism, Art and Survival in the Age of Pandemic, published by Sober's Cove Press in 2022. And from 2019 to 2024, he was an artist in residence at 18th Street Arts Center in Santa Monica. In summer of 2025, he will exhibit new work in the Spotlight series at the Chinese-American Museum of Chicago. Please put your hands together with me and welcome Dan to the stage.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for all being here. I want to thank the college and the studio art department and the generous donors and the supporters of this kind of programming, including the Cohen family for the support of the exhibition. I want to thank Jerry Otten for all of his incredible hands-on support and good humor. So I'm really honored to join this impressive roster of artists in residence at Dartmouth College, a program that is unusual, if not entirely unique. Okay, so there were a bunch of ways to go with this lecture, and I figured that because there are a lot of presumably young people who may go into the arts as a future, I will do a little bit of a genealogy of my own coming into being as an artist, so you can get some perspective on somebody who's looking back on their own journey as an artist and thinker from the perspective of middle age and middle career. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a three-part representation of these key teachers that I had when I was your ages and even younger. So right on the left side of that screen, the Fifth Estate, How Deep is Deep Ecology, that article, that is an underground newspaper from out of Detroit that has been continuously publishing since 1965, and it's one of the very few of the underground publications from that time period that is still going. And by the time I was in high school in the early and mid 80s, that had transformed from a kind of like a street level rag that had like all the sort of like countercultural ads in it and reviews of, you know, rock shows and coverage of the politics in a kind of vein that is very familiar if you were to look at all of the underground press of the late 60s. By the 80s, it had turned itself into something of a journal for anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas. And then I discovered that one of the main writers of this for this publication, including the author of that article, was a guy named David Watson, and he was a teacher at my high school. And I got to know him because he was a Spanish teacher. I didn't take Spanish, but he came into one of my English classes and I did a guest spot. And so there I think 17 years old, and he came in and he taught Nadja, the experimental novel by Andre Breton. A pretty interesting avant-garde piece of literature to be exposed to at that age. And at that time, meaning a time before the 1960s and the histories of the 60s and 70s was really historicized. So all of that was sort of in this Reagan hangover period. And, you know, we weren't really exposed as young people just coming into adulthood to all of that counterculture in any official level, right? We were kind of discovering it on our own, and here's this guy comes into this English class and serves it up in a pretty interesting way. So that was early. And then in college, I met these two on the other side of the screen. Black and white down in the corner there is Paul Wellstone, and I was exposed to him very early. It was my first fall in college, so I was only 18 years old. And he was a professor of political science at Carleton College, who now is remembered for being a US senator who died in a plane crash, a very tragic thing. But he was let's put him in the context here, was Paul Wellstone, Russ Feingold in Wisconsin, and Bernie Sanders in Vermont, who were cut of the same cloth, same generation, working class identified advocates, Jewish from states that were not known for having big Jewish populations, who all came out in this sort of with an American variety of a social democratic vision. But as a teacher, he was one of these people who was bringing in this, at that time, recent history of the social struggles of the 60s and 70s and making it legible to us students who were born after the fact. So that was a big influence on me in terms of understanding one's agency as an organizer, as a citizen. I'll say more about the citizen thing as we go forward. And then the picture at the top is a woman named Maria Lugones, who I also was encountered in college. And she's a feminist philosopher, Argentine, and at that time, I mean, now people read her work and look at her life's work, and they use the words or the terms decolonial as a way to contextualize her work. At that time, she was really in a world and thought of as a lesbian separatist, because that was a thing. So she was a kind of exposure for me to a rigorous treatment of not only gender, but power in general. So I'll go forward from there. And then artistically, I had this other kind of genealogy and emergence going on where my very early exposure to any sort of fine art in a real way was through this man. And this is a picture that, my dad captured of the two of us many years later, decades later. But when I was a small child, I was, I think, 10 years old or 11 years old, Yang Xianrang, he was a printmaker, woodcut artist, graphic artist, and Chinese painter. He came to the US to visit for the first time, and he was a family friend who'd been separated from my family through the lack of communication between revolutionary China and the West. But we had this long shared history. And by the time that he was able to travel out of China, he was a dean at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. And in the history of art in China, apologize for the small image here, but many of his woodcuts have actually are like these iconic images from the Revolutionary period. And he came to the U.S. and he came and he stayed with my family for about 3 weeks, and my dad bought supplies for him, and he just made art for like 3 weeks in my basement, and I just like watched him. So that was something obviously I've never forgotten, and actually grew and grew in the significance of my own imagination and my own development. So this was another one of his iconic woodcuts, a portrait of Zhou Enlai. And then later on, when I became an adult and went into art, we reconnected, and he helped me with introductions to people in China. Okay, so let's step back to do a little bit of theorizing and a theorizing of my own work too. So here's a kind of abstract spheres. This is how I just think of the world and how I think of how humans are in the world with our works and the way we interpret the world. These three spheres, they overlap, right? But it's abstract. It's not doesn't give you much more information than just the three spheres. So taking those three spheres and adjusting them for how for the conditions that we contend with now, this is kind of how I think about it, right? The political sphere in our world now is huge, and we're living through a politically saturated moment where it's really difficult to not be political. Like, it's kind of impossible to not be political, right? And then the aesthetic sphere, the sphere of cultural expression, stylization, visual vocabularies, all those kinds of things. Those are very much politicized, right? It's difficult within that sphere to escape the political meanings of culture and aesthetics, right? Maybe you can, or temporarily, or in certain kinds of insulated or protected contexts, but for the most part, the political has sort of the incursion of the political has really taken a lot of that terrain, and then the religious has shrunk a lot. Right? Like 4 centuries ago, that would have been the biggest sphere. And now it's reduced to this little area, and the places of overlap are correspondingly smaller. And for myself, I'm often aiming for that tiny little place where the three now overlay each other, and where one can simultaneously have one's work be meaningful in all 3 ways. But that space is collapsing, right? Okay, so lately I was not that long ago, I was looking at this. This is diagram, a kind of mapping of the art world by the artist Andrea Fraser. Performance artist, conceptual artist, based in LA, and it's compelling. I think it's interesting, and I was thinking of maybe how would I do this for myself in my own practice. So here made an attempt in simplifying a kind of scheme for my own practice to help make it legible. So there's the basic scheme. You know, this is my art making in that gray box where it goes in these different directions, and the green organizing activism, that's always been a constant and big part of my life, whereas the art market and collector's market up there in the corner has always been fairly remote and not too relevant to my work. And then my writing kind of goes between all of these different modes, or links all of them. Then I started to put in some media vectors of like, oh, here's my letterpress work that connects this area and this area, and then, you know, the sculpture. Then it got really messy really quickly, so I kind of gave that up. So I'll leave that for now as a useful scheme. But from there, we can bring it into the real world, into my home for since 2017, Los Angeles, which of course is suffering unbelievable losses right now. But another way to try to make sense of the space that, you know, I travel or move through or live in, and just try to understand as a place with flows, with conditions that one has to think hard about if, say in Los Angeles, one wants to get from one end of town to another. And further, so I think a lot about this map, so I'm bringing it kind of on a temporal level to a different scale. This is a detail of a large map of the upper Midwest, which is where I spent most of my life, that was hand-worked and hand-drawn by a kind of an outsider cartographer named Paul Durand, a man who, he died about 10 years ago. He was a Minnesotan, and his lifelong work was collecting indigenous and native place names for that region that he was from. So you can see, do you see the cursor up there? Yeah, that is the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers. So that is present day Minneapolis and St. Paul in that large metro area up there, right? And I say it's a temporally expansive because the indigenous peoples did not map the land in this way, right? They didn't draw these kinds of maps. So one wonders whether this is a representation of the past or maybe a representation of the future. And that is a kind of expansiveness that starts to break up those three spheres, right? It's not just political or not just aesthetic, it's not just religious, it starts to be all three of those things. Okay, so that was sort of a little, you know, kind of a schematic picture of my own practice, my own way of thinking, regrounding it with real world information. Now I'll go into a sort of a description of after all this many years of political engagement and study of history and study of social movements and study of art history, where I've landed with my own understanding of the conditions with which we have to contend. And really at the top of that list is a whole history of leftist failure. The entire history of the left is you know, a history of failure. And what where does that leave us when so much of that history and so many of those projects were driven by a kind of idealism and utopian thinking and a a specific sort of imagination, an imagination that allowed one to grasp a very different and much improved world. And if that's over, or has been crushed so many times, then where are we? So this is just a little detail of a drawing that I did that encapsulates this problem for us. And these are the kinds of this idea is just you see it through a lot of my work, specifically in relation to 20th century art history and 20th century art forms. Part of that is because my parents came to this country in the early 60s, and they surfed a wave of post-World War II welcome and economic expansion, which they benefited from. And I come into my life where that starts to fray a bit, and by the time I'm a young adult, for those who can see clearly, it's really the decay is already beginning in the 80s, and that's something that I'm kind of obsessed with. This is a little letterpress print, it's about this big. It's a quotation taken from The Totality for Kids, which is a situationist text from 1962. And it served as a reminder, when I was reading that text, that this little passage just jumped out at me, because then I realized that these problems that I've been thinking about are not new at all. And even by mid-century, there were radicals who understood that the utopian vector, political vector, was no more, and that once you engage in actual power struggles, it's all this kind of stuff, these unintended consequences or these unforeseen subsequent conditions that one's own political engagement, which is coming from like a liberation motivation, may lead to. Again, this is it was a fragment of a text taken from what we'd now call a zine, what was then called a underground press or underground publication, a pamphlet produced in Detroit, where from 1968, the year I was born, from Detroit, where labor strikes were probably in the 20th century, probably the most widely occurring and the most frequently threatened. But even by 1968, as early as 1968, long before the accelerated deindustrialization of the early 80s, there was already this kind of a critique coming from leftists and radicals within the labor movements and within the unions. And just material note, so that was all handset, wood type, metal type, printed, and then copied, photocopied, and then burned onto a screen. So it's kind of combination letterpress and screen printing. So this is what I want, what I hope for. I don't know what it looks like now in today's time. I know that in the former times, say like in 1968, when there were these radicals critiquing their own leftist formations, that the think separately part was very, very discouraged. There's a lot of reasons for why the unions have lost influence. One of them is because the largest and entrenched union bureaucracies of the industrial Midwest, where I was a kid, were not democratic at all. But how does one revive any of that is the question now. Just presenting these kinds of little text fragments as thought prompts to me feels like sometimes that's the most effective thing I can do. This was just a one-off postcard. So in going back to that scheme of my own practice, built into my thinking and where I want my artwork to go and how I would like for it to circulate in the world, it's never comfortably set well with the retail circulation of fine art. Because I keep doing stuff like this, just making little pieces of art that I mail to people and so forth. So this is a quotation from the philosopher Alain Badiou, who's alive and really interesting French thinker of a post-68 generation. And this is kind of like this last kind of thought prompt piece, where if we're going to revive any of these alternatives to capitalism or work on formations that can in any way effectively counter the logic of capital, we have to re-examine what those things are when long ago, 2 generations ago, bureaucratic communism had been, discredited, right? 1968 was very much about that, the worldwide struggles of that year. Didn't happen until between 1989 and 1991 that the actual bureaucratic apparatuses of primarily Soviet Union and Russia disintegrated. Right, so there's a generation-long lag between the discrediting and the actual dismantlement, and that's 20 years of cynicism. That's 20 years of attachment to something that has already been discredited. And how does one now rework that? One of the ways, and Badiou is pretty useful for this, is examining again the structure of these formations in relation to scale. And he makes these interesting kind of arguments about politics, art, love, and science, right? So politics on one end of politics is this mass thing. It's all of us. We're all implicated, everybody in the society. Love is this individual thing. It's you, yourself, and typically one other person, maybe more, but it's small scale. And then the fields that mediate the two are science and art, because you have these shared ideas or shared collective projects of trying to make these artistic or aesthetic or scientific projects work, and you interface with a field of people in each of those. So that's his thing. So again, it's in a way, I'll write conventionally, like essays or whatever, but in my artwork, it's often, I find it to be a useful exercise just for me to distill some sort of useful, philosophy or theory work into, just one or two sentences or even a fragment, so as to somehow put into relief a promising vein that then we can further explore. How are we doing on time? Okay. I can speed it up. So, but this, just like the map of the traffic in LA, this at ground level in this material way, this is what we have to contend with. It's not just the loss of our ideals or the zero traction that utopian thinking gets now, but it's also that capital is so efficient in its enclosure of new spaces, in its opening of new markets, et cetera. So this was when I was in Penglai, China, and I just thought this image was so interesting, where this is this second tier, maybe third tier city in China, opposite the Korean Peninsula, and you go there and it's like you don't see any Americans or Europeans, but you see a lot of Koreans, because this place is making this bid to attract all these Korean retirees with its Italian style living, and golf, of course. And that, right, that vision of life is like, you can imagine it, you can have it, like it's available, and capital delivers it. So this is what we're up against, right? Okay, small image again, sorry. Going quickly, this is a campaign I like to talk about because it was so exemplary and in the end historic. So this was an initiative that started in Chicago called Tams Year 10. It was started by an artist named Laurie Jo Reynolds, a fantastically articulate and organizer. And this was about an attempt to, at first, just make contact with the people, the men, who were incarcerated in TAMS, T-A-M-M-S, the TAMS Correctional Facility at the far bottom of the state of Illinois, a so-called supermax prison, in cells 23 and a half hours a day. The idea from a criminal justice point of view or voice was that this was for the worst of the worst. And in practice, that is not what happened. A lot of the men who ended up at TAMS were people whose original sentence and original crime was not the worst of, not the most heinous of crimes, and they ended up in TAMS for disciplinary reasons once they were incarcerated. So there were many reasons to shut down TAMS, and how do you do that? This is an example of me contributing in a very small way to an art project that was also a political campaign that had a standard of success or failure, and that success or failure was whether we could actually help close this prison. And one of the moments in this campaign was to draw on the tradition or the legacy of the Memphis sanitation worker strike, the one that Dr. King went to support when he was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, and that produced these iconic signs, these I am a man signs. And the reason that the TAMS group chose this as a strategy was because at the time, Illinois was undergoing its kind of perennial or budget crisis thing. And there was an opportunity to defund the word defund, which came into wide parlance later after George Floyd, to defund the prison. And to do that, they had to counter the main lobbying force advocating for the continued operation of TAMS. And TAMS was they had all these economic arguments, right? It was like, Illinois can no longer afford this kind of incarceration, high cost, low return kind of model of incarceration that, by the way, is torturing these inmates according to all of these human rights groups, right? And the organization, lobbying group trying to keep it open was AFSCME, the public sector workers union. The same public sector workers union that organized the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. So TAMS, right, the artists and organizers of TAMS were like, let's use that history against this lobbying effort, right? We want to call attention to the fact that this union today has lost sight of its own values. So they did that through a campaign they called I Am a Mom, and they had mothers of those incarcerated to take part in these actions, including straight up, very boring, very tedious, not exciting work of lobbying at the legislature. And so this is the bed of my press, where artists were invited or asked to contribute signage for this campaign. So that's one of the signs. That's in Chicago. In front of photos of all the men incarcerated in TAMS. That's one of the mothers. I think I can leave that. So the good news there, and the historic part, is that TAMS was closed. They actually defunded TAMS, and I like talking about this because there are so many kind of self-identified radicals or people who are very committed to causes and different movement kinds of work, who, when presented with a problem like TAMS or any large edifice that needs to be changed, reformed, or shut down, I hear this a lot. The answer, or a kind of knee-jerk response, is just to say to burn it down. We got to burn it down. Burn it all down, right? And you could try to burn it down, but really, when it comes down to it, the only way that you close down these kinds of big institutions that employ a whole lot of people is to zero out the budget in a line item, and that's what happened. But that's imperfect. It does not. The people who were in TAMS, the men who were incarcerated, were not released. They were all transferred to other prisons. Nonetheless, they achieved their goal. The organization achieved its goal, and the activists achieved their goal. So that's the kind of conversation and the kind of example I think that needs to be more widely had on the left. And an artist like Lori Jo Reynolds, who understands going into that whole effort, which consumed her life for those years, knowing that the success, achieving that success, this really ambitious standard of success of closing this place down, would still not be, by the standards of abolition, a success. So I think that's something that we on the left need to really grapple with, which is like how we understand what an achievement is. And on some level, we're so accustomed to failure that we almost take the possibilities for successes out of our own sight sometimes. Okay, so just turning the attention to a completely different body of work, and something that's, mine, right? Solo authorship, not a collaboration, but a more, I don't want to say abstract level because it's not abstract. You'll see what I mean, but more more reflective and more theoretical, but also less. It's not an organizing exercise. It's not embedded in a campaign, but it's about taking one's space as an artist to somehow shed light on these large patterns that we're living through. So this was just a very simple series of drawings, a sequence of drawings that traced the fluctuations in the prime lending rate as set by the Fed from December of 1972 to December of 1973. And in that period, those 13 months, the Fed adjusted the rate 19 times. So it's like almost every 3 weeks, there was a change in the prime lending rate. Now, if you're listening to like the radio, like NPR, top of the hour, right, there'll be a little thing in the headlines of like, oh, Fed Open Market Committees meets today is expected to raise the rate by a quarter point, and like for a quarter, for a whole, 3 months. So what was going on there? Right, it was the oil crisis, which had to do with the Arab-Israeli war and the OPEC, which were largely Arab countries at that time, punishing the West, which was not producing much of its own oil at that time, for its support of Israel. So that whole thing has been going on for a very long time too. I want to point that out. But that was the first time in the post-war period, post-World War II period, that the Fed used the interest rate as a way to respond to a financial crisis. And I drew, this is the part where I was saying, it's a theoretically informed piece, but very material. I drew all these drawings using pens, ballpoint pens from the failed big banks of 2008. So just these line drawings, right, in using the negative space to specify the rate. And I drew them with those pens on collected, just from my junk mail, all these like pre-approved credit offers that one was getting at that time. So the idea here was to draw an arc between the 1972-73 financial crisis and the 2008 financial crisis. And in like, say, if you're taking economics here at Dartmouth, like your standard neoclassical, microeconomics and macroeconomics, you don't talk about history at all. It's completely ahistorical. And yet there is this whole layered history to the whole thing, all of it having to do with politics, right? The Arab-Israeli conflict, 73, what's going on in 2008, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see, so this was where that year started, that whole sequence of events, December of 1972. The rate was at 6%, which we consider, I have to back up. Maybe not you, right? But people who like maybe bought a house like 10 years ago, we would consider that high. And you can see in the piece of paper there, right? And this Windows thing, like financing for new Windows. See, like a 2.99, 2.99%, right? So you start to see the craziness of how low the rates were for a very long time. And in those in those 13 months, the rate went up to 10 and then went back down a little bit. And now, right, the rates, what, in like a year ago, were like 8% here, set by the Fed, which was, for my generation, right, Gen Xers and younger, was very high. We all came of age with very low rates. So yeah, 3.89. So here's just a gallery view of how they were arranged. That sculpture is not mine. That was a two-person show, and that sculpture was made by a really great artist named Sebrin Versteeg. That's from the postcard that I made for that show. And I sent postcards for this show, and I always think of postcards as a extension of the show. And I have some right here. So if I did not mail you one, you could come and get a postcard if you want. Okay, so it's winding down here, and maybe I should just stop right there and start to do a AMA, Ask Me Anything.
I have a mic.
Yeah, and as people are maybe hopefully thinking of questions, and again, right, AMA doesn't have to be about anything I showed here. There's a sculptural work on the wall in the gallery, and there are 3 prepared books as elements in that piece. And one of those books is by this, was one of my sheroes, this poet named Pat Parker, and I'm gonna read a poem of hers while you're thinking this through. And this has to do with citizenship. So that whole show is about, because I'm tracing these contradictions, these political contradictions into the past, and really getting to this point where I feel like it, for me at least, revisiting the French Revolution and the legacy of the French Revolution and the afterlives of the French Revolution is more and more relevant. And that the idea, the concept of a citizen appropriated from Athenian democracy and applied to late 1800s or late 18th century Europe and France is kind of, that's a lot of what the revolution was about, and that's what we live with today, that legacy. So here is a poem by Pat Parker. Where do you go to become a non-citizen? This is from the late 70s, I want to add. I want to resign, I want out. I want to march to the nearest place, give my letter to a smiling face. I want to resign. I want out. President Ford vetoed a jobs bill sent to him from Capitol Hill. While we sit by being super cool, he gets a $60,000 swimming pool. I want to resign. I want out. $68,000 to Queen Elizabeth to not grow cotton, yet there's no uproar that this jive is rotten. $14,000 to Ford Motors to not plant wheat. I guess the government don't want wheat all over the seats. I want to resign. I want out. The CIA commission was in session for 26 weeks long, said the boys didn't do much wrong. They gave out acid, a test, so they tell, yet if you and I used it, we'd be in jail. I want to resign. I want out. And from Taft College, a small group of fools chased all the black students out of the school, and good citizens worried about property sale chased away black teenagers from picturesque Carmel. I want to resign. I want out. The Little League, after using all excuses up, says a 10-year-old girl must use a boy's supportive cup. An International Women's Congress in Mexico to make plans, elected their president, a white liberal man. I want to resign. I want out. The APA finally said all gays aren't ill, yet ain't no refunds on their psychiatry bills. A federal judge says MCC is valid, a reality, yet it won't keep the pigs from hurting you or me. I want to resign. I want out. I want to resign. I want out. Please lead me to the place. Show me the smiling face. I'm skeptical, full of doubt. I want to resign. I want out. How do you not be a citizen in a world where if you're born into a country, you're generally a citizen of that place, but not always. And the whole idea of a citizen has become more fraught. Okay, thanks. Questions? Got your question?
Oh, it's not real. How about you?
I have an irrelevant question, but I'll ask it anyway. Earlier in the lecture, really early on, you showed a Venn diagram of your established old identities and power dominators in the market versus power dominated identities. And it went a little bit too quickly for me to decipher it. And I also am looking at it right now, and I'm still struggling a little bit to understand your thinking about that, since I feel like it was really an internal organization. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that diagram, because it's really fascinating.
The Andrea Fraser diagram, this one?
Oh, sorry, that was Andrea Fraser. I'm
the
sorry.
The detailed one?
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think. And it's I think it's pretty useful and not terribly far off. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you finished with that?
Yeah, sure. I'll leave this up, though, for us to look at, since it went by so fast.
So my question is, if the artist activist's intention is to shut down a particular prison, and those inmates are then, none of them are released, and they go to other institutions, which are by and large already overcrowded, does that represent a success for the activist, artist?
I would say so. Yes.
On what level?
That, okay, well, to me, power in its most basic application is one group of people making another group of people making them do something they really don't want to do. And we did that. And whether or not the lives of the incarcerated people was really improved, that has to be evaluated afterwards, because they were part of the movement and they were part of the demand, right? So it was something that the inmates themselves were helping to do. Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, I can live with that consequence, right? I can, and all those inmates had come from other prisons. It's not like they know more about all of that than all of us, right? And if they're saying shut it down, and if these artists come into the picture and say, hey, the TAMS committee started as a totally experimental. It was just, they had no relationship with the inmates. What they started as, and it started in an art gallery, Gallery 400, the academic gallery just like here of UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, as part of a show, as part of their programming. They did this thing called the TAM, they just maybe a one-off time thing, TAMS Poetry Committee, where people just came to the gallery for an afternoon and wrote poems on postcards and sent them to random inmates at TAMS. And people wrote back, and they started correspondence. And then the next phase of that was they called themselves the Thames Poetry Committee. They organized an event to just send letters or postcards with return stub or something that could be returned with postage paid of just what do you need right now? Just that question. And they got back, like, I need toothpaste. I need to get the fuck out of here. Right? Yeah, all of that. And that begins the new formation of, now maybe we start to know each other. Where do we go from here? How do we make something more out of this? Oh, well, yeah, let's maybe shut this place down. That would be kind of fantastic. And all those guys that are in Thames, they know about the overcrowded places. They know about, Stateville or, these other, which is the prison down in Joliet. If you ever hear people say, oh yeah, he was in Joliet, they're talking about Stateville prison. They know more about that. So if you're living a life that is so incredibly, heavily defined by that kind of power and control, and it's whatever. It's all part of a justice system and a whole idea of paying one's debts to society. All of that, and you're like, I'm okay with paying my debt to society. I should do that, but that never included Thames. That really, I should be back at Stateville, where you're not in a cell for 23 and a half hours a day with no human contact, right? So on many levels of details, it was an improvement.
Has anybody traced that? Does anybody know that that's true? I'm all for the empowerment. As
I
far
don't
as-
know that.
Yeah. Well, that's my question.
But there are people who've been since released who still, who are part of this network of activists and, engaged artists, especially in Chicago.
My question, this diagram is really interesting, and I thank you for your talk and your work, and it's great to have you here as artist in residence. I feel like there's a component missing in the kind of contextual discussion, and that's the world outside of the human-centered world. When you talk about the religious and the social and, the context of your work, it seems to exclude the rest of the species on Earth and the rest of the biosphere. And this diagram doesn't include any of the impact that we make as human beings on the world. And how does your work relate to that?
Well, there was an image I was trying to look for. I couldn't find it in all the digital clutter just before this talk. Part of the genealogy thing, but it's related to the how deep is deep ecology first image I talked about. But I have a picture and a picture of the cover, the title page of my undergraduate thesis. So I went to a college where you're a senior and you have to do a senior kind of project or thesis, and this epigram that I put there ahead of the title was a quotation from Ernesto Cardenal. Does that name mean anything to anybody? He's a Nicaraguan poet and minister of culture under the Sandinistas. And I was going to show that because it goes a little bit towards addressing your question, where that quotation goes, the revolution, meaning the Nicaraguan revolution, is not just for the people, but it's for the birds, the fishes, the air, the water. And my thesis was on Chinese religion and then the emerging philosophical subdiscipline of environmental ethics. So for me, just personally, it's been a long, pretty basic kind of value motivation. In my work, it's been a lot less front and center, partly because I feel like, having come out not only as formalized in that one senior thesis, but just in my younger formative period, coming out from a kind of like pretty crunchy granola, lifestyle and subculture, I got to the point where I felt like a lot of that was being addressed by other people, and these problems of social difference as relates to organizing and class-based kinds of politics were. People weren't addressing them in the way that I felt like they should be addressed. So that's partly one of the reasons why. But it's been there from the beginning, and that first image, How Deep is Deep Ecology, that was an essay that was written by David Watson. That was a critique. It was this kind of like anti-authoritarian critique coming out of Detroit, this deindustrialized, a landscape of ruin, that was critiquing, at the time, the deep ecology movement, like Earth First, and the preservation of ancient forests, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's on my mind, but you're right to perceive it as not really visible in the work.
Sorry. I notice in a lot of your pieces you take words and quotes from other activists, and I was wondering if you feel like you're able to claim those pieces as your own art, and how, like, I guess in terms of when you do produce this art, what meaning and like alternative meanings you add when you take those words and quotes.
Yeah, I take pretty freely, and I feel I assume a license to do that because I feel like I'm just transforming the words so much in how they're delivered, how they circulate, what they look like. Being a writer myself, I'm okay with my own words or texts getting chopped up and used. Being somebody who's worked a lot with language at a material level with, movable type, there's a built-in kind of detachment from the language because of that, because you're setting all this type very carefully, and then you proof it and you adjust it and make it just right, and then you break it up and distribute it and put it back into the cases, and you're never going to set that text again. So I think that to me has helped, has sort of made me be like pretty free and not think too hard about. Is your question about theft?
Not necessarily. I guess like because you use these quotes from other people, I was wondering more about like how you transform those words and like, for instance, what determines which font you use, how do you determine the spacing? I guess how do you add a different meaning and transformation?
Yeah, like for example, like that, right? We called a strike and nobody came, right? It was pretty idiosyncratic layout, and because it's done on letterpress in my own, the shop that I used to have, a lot of that is determined by what letters you have and in what sizes and what kind of paper. So subjecting the language to a pretty tight but somewhat random set of constraints just builds into the process of making a kind of organic variation on the the original language. That's always been interesting to me, that whole process, because then the line of text that I've taken will become something very different, even to my own reading, and including if those are my own words. So kind of like the question about the ecology thing, or the environmental, concerns. Pretty early, I think, and I trace this to having grown up in a household with some Chinese art on the walls, and where almost all of that traditional art was like the image text relationship was pretty fluid and kind of taken for granted, and there was always this whole long tradition of the figurative element and the relationship to the little poetic piece of text next to it, or calligraphy, right? And then it's like, well, what does a calligraphy look like? So all of that was I kind of internalized as a young person, and you're right to notice all of that, for sure. But at this point, until I'm actually working with that text, and you'll see it in some of the work, in this show, and even in the poster. Like the other day I put that poster together. I still kind of like have that kind of playful, or I think it's playful. I mean, it's playful to me. Like, I feel like I'm playing, but a kind of looseness to how the text could look. And I always wanted it to look good, or somehow interesting, or maybe surprising. But yeah.
Thank you. One, maybe piggybacking off that question I had was about if you could say a little bit more about your relationship to print media. And, I'm thinking maybe that piece that you mentioned, you letterpress, and then it's a photocopy, and then it's a screen, and maybe in relationship to your genealogy too, like what attracted you to print media? Did you know you wanted to be a printmaker? Anything related to that?
Well, I think one of my first like true fixations or true obsessions, as we grew up in a family that was not musical but visual art oriented, right? Nobody played instruments or sang in my family, but everybody kind of drew or had very good handwriting. So I grew up with that comfort level, and like a little bit of like confidence with a pen or instrument a mark making instrument in my hand. And then it was really Fillmore posters and psychedelic concert posters that caught my attention as a world, as a whole kind of visual world. It had to do with my interest in that counterculture widely, but I really spent time, like kind of studying the especially the lettering. The lettering. If you know what I'm talking about, these Fillmore posters with the psychedelic, right, kind of hard to read lettering. And then after that, I started paying attention to the colors, because these original posters would have right, lime green and dusty orange, or something like a vibrant color combinations. And then after that, I started thinking about the dissemination of these posters. At the time, they were not quite collectors' items yet, and you could see that they had been posted somewhere or had somehow had a life out in the world through their wear. So that was part of it. I think it took me a while to start to connect dots of just that, and then kind of the whole huge universe of print media, even within a kind of counterculture, like the comics and the pamphlets and the underground papers. So that was my entry point. And then, when I took a printmaking class, then I was introduced to, German expressionists and the earlier history of print media as fine art, and the history of print media as a bridge between fine art and trade and mass media. I didn't talk about it at all here, but the press that you saw the bed of, that was a 1961 Vandercook SP15. And I'm particularly interested in that press and presses of that vintage, because it's a proof press, and it occupies this pretty short window in the history of printing, where there was an overlap of manual labor and photomechanical mass reproduction. So in that period, these trade printers or job printers, or say like newspapers, they would have a press room where the compositors would set the type by hand, and then they would proof it on that press and get a perfect proof, adjust the press and adjust the ink until they got a really clean proof. And then, they would do all the typo editing and all that, make the adjustments and get that perfect proof, and then take it to the next room where they would transfer that to film by taking a photographic image of it, and then taking that film to the large industrial lithographic presses, right? So you had this kind of like interesting, so you have like mass printed by the thousands or millions or tens of thousands objects, newspapers or whatever. You look at it and you still see like the spacing and the hyphenation, right? Hyphenating and the columns of text that were hand set. And that window didn't last long. But that machine, the SP15, was highly controllable for that reason, because it was never meant to print thousands of whatever. It was just meant to print one perfect proof, right? And that's why it's become a kind of desired by artists, later on, as they were made obsolete. Artists discovered that, oh, well, they're really controllable. You can do really fine work on them. So that's a long answer.
That was really interesting. To jump to another topic, earlier in your talk, you had that small print from your mentor of what looked like a man holding the little red book. And I was curious, with this phenomenon right now of TikTok being banned and you engaging with media and culture, and this like group of so-called like social media refugees heading over to the app Little Red Book, and that being in the mainstream right now, if you have thoughts or plans to engage with that as an artist.
Probably not engage. I just heard about it today, and I heard it, the way I heard about it was somebody griping about how it's being hashtagged wrong or something. It's like, let it settle for a while and then see what it is. Social media is pretty, yeah. What are you going to do with it, right? No plans at the moment is a short answer, but curious about where it goes. I never even made it to TikTok, right? My daughter sends me little things that I'll look at, but I myself have not ventured into that. I only have so much headspace for so much social media. One question I get a lot is I think probably a lot of artists get is like, well, what about AI? What's AI going to do? My answer to that is I think AI is going to, in the end, it's going to make the analog more valuable. So I'm not too worried about AI.
One more question, and then we'll go to the opening reception.
Hi, I really liked your mention of like zines and underground journals. I'm wondering if like those are still like a thing and if you've ever like contributed to one of them and like how you think of like print material like that, like surviving or evolving in like such a largely digital age.
Yeah, this is kind of a specific vein, jumping off the last of this thing about analog and AI. We are living through a kind of golden age right now of print media because the means are so available, printing on demand or all kinds of pretty affordable, like the whole deflationary economics of electronics has come down to all of the hard copy kinds of technologies as well. And tons of artists are making use of that. Not only that, but like for many years I was driven to make letterpress work because I felt like a duty to keep that craft knowledge alive. And now I no longer feel that because there are so many people who are 25 years younger than me who have really taken up that mantle and are keeping all of that alive. It's amazing. But if you want to see it, you should try to go to any art book fair that happens in big city near you. Probably one in Boston, but the sort of recent, granddaddy of them is the New York Art Book Fair, which is, I mean, that's a multi-day affair to get through all of that, and to see what people are making is unbelievable, and to go into a big space like PS1, which is where it usually is, and see all the tables of all these people making all these little, posters, all sorts of stuff. And most of it, I'm just going to guess, has probably no online footprint. And that's kind of the window into this whole vibrant world of, I'm not going to call it underground anymore, it's above ground, but self-publishing or small-scale publishing, grassroots print media. It's pretty explosive. I mean, it's an overwhelming thing to see all collected in one space. But I would recommend going, making it down, if you haven't, to like the New York Art Book Fair, because there you'll see not only the individual pieces, but then it's like, oh, this is person behind this table is the dealer or the publisher or the maker, like people who are pretty involved in all of that are easy to talk to and are all there. So that's one place. And yes, I mean, I have contributed myself. Yeah.
Great. Dan, thank you. Everybody, let's go to the reception.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.